Hello and welcome to PSA's Let's Squawk About It. The coronavirus pandemic has swept through the globe, changing all of our lives over the course of the past year. However, some countries have managed to weather the storm. Today, I'm excited to welcome Mathew with Aviagen New Zealand as we discuss how that country has practically been rid of the virus. Abby, welcome.
Hi, Sam. How are you? Good morning from New Zealand.
Yeah, and good afternoon from the US. Abby, why don't we start by you telling us a little bit about yourself, your area of expertise, and what you do?
All right. Well, first off, Sam, thanks again for having me on here just to give a different uh, kind of global outlook on COVID-19, especially with the poultry industry. So again, my name is Mathew. I'm the operations manager for Aviagen New Zealand. In this role specifically, I look after a team which oversees our internal operations, which consists of grandparent and great grandparent farms, as well as importation of eggs and a hatchery. So I started my career with Aviagen in the USA back in 2003, specifically in quality at hatcheries. And over the last roughly 18 years, I've spent time in the US, Australia, and now here in New Zealand for the last roughly 3.5 years.
Where you're located in New Zealand, COVID-19 appears to be relatively under control. I'm sure there were changes that took place not only at the public level, but also within the poultry industry itself. So, what changes did you experience with operations to combat COVID-19?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Sam. So, in my opinion, there are a couple of really key, separate, but really important aspects of not only the New Zealand industry's approach to COVID, but also Aviagen, so globally and locally. First off, as an industry, our primary concern, of course, was the health and well-being of every single team member, whether that was us, whether that was the producers, the growers. It was extremely important that we kept people safe and maintained their well-being. We realized that without a healthy team, that we would be absolutely unable to maintain our role in the food supply chain and, of course, our global vision in feeding people. As a company in general, again, as a global business, we were in constant communications with multiple stakeholders across the world, including airlines, freight forwarders, our customers, our suppliers, et cetera, just to make sure and just to ensure that the food supply chain continued with as little interruption as possible. And then locally, we were not only in communications with the stakeholders that I just talked about, but we were also really heavily involved with civil defense, the Poultry Industry Association of New Zealand, the Ministry of Social Development, and the Ministry for Primary Industry. So there was a lot of information sharing during this time just to make sure that us as an industry and as a company, we got it all right. Now, if we kind of dive a little bit deeper, specifically as a company, we had two main challenges. The first, of course, and I touched on this just a second ago, was ensuring the health, safety, and well-being of our New Zealand team and our family. The second point of that was maintaining the food supply chain. So within our business, the major changes that revolved around those two things. So I'll touch on the first one. So ensuring the health and safety of our team, this is where we really had to adapt and where the bulk of the changes occurred. So with staff, we had to look at social distancing and how to ensure the safety of every single person individually. We had to look at social bubbles, especially when looking at different functional areas within our business. So when looking at farms, in the hatchery, and even in the office, we had to ensure business continuity. So along with that, we had to stagger staff. We had to start doing more shift work. We had to coordinate break times and even physically separate staff who were typically in close contact with each other. We also had a push by the government to enable staff to work from home if they could. And then a big part of this too was adapting to our workforce's needs, especially with regards to schools being closed, parents, their needs and having to take care of children, ensuring that at-risk staff isolated. So we're talking about employees who are either aged or pregnant or those with underlying health conditions. And then we even had to go as far as providing letters to staff to travel to and from work. These were done during our level 4 and level 3 lockdowns. this was just to prove that every member or every person of our team traveling had a reason to be traveling and was a part of essential business. I think we did a pretty good job. But then there were also a lot of other aspects to this. So we had lots of enhanced PPE protocols, especially in areas where it typically wasn't needed, such as break rooms, offices, even carpooling. We had to have people wear masks just to ensure if someone did have COVID, that it wasn't being spread. We had protocols built in if employees or their partners or families who were all in that same social bubble, if they had COVID-like symptoms, and along with that, getting tested and isolating. Now, as a company, we did a lot with communications and updates. So we took a lot of information globally that we had, but then we had to adapt it to kind of a local type of feel, especially with what was happening in New Zealand. So we issued constant communications to our staff and reassured them of national updates, whether it be around lockdowns, new procedures, new protocols, et cetera. But then again, we were all separate still. So we had to figure out, well, how do we meet while being separate? So we've always used as Aviagen, again, a global company, and we can't travel all the time. We've used virtual meetings in the past, but this became even more important during COVID. So we had to figure out a way to use these virtual type communications when we're all separated within the same city. So literally streets away from each other where we couldn't be in physical contact. So we couldn't have meetings face to face. So we used things like Zoom, lots of Zoom meetings, as you can imagine. And then of course, because of New Zealand and some requirements we had, we also had to track and trace all of our movements. So this was not only physical written down movements, we also used electronic movements. And then of course, through New Zealand, we use the COVID-19 scanner app, where you can literally scan a QR code and it alerts the government, okay, this is what locations people were at in the event there was an outbreak. So yeah, as a company, dealing with the health and well-being, that was probably the biggest change we saw. But again, being a global company, maintaining the food supply chain was just as important as that. So for us specifically, we saw really big changes with the supply chain. So we as a business had to think about how we could effectively get our breeding stock to customers on our side of the world. And of course, this was even more difficult as flights completely disappeared.
What you'd mentioned with all the communications piece, talking within the company itself, and then talking about where you're at in New Zealand and working with the government there was a lot of communication that went behind all of this. And then after all that's done comes the implementation piece. And that kind of segues perfectly into my next question, which is about the implementation. Did you guys find success in these changes that you communicated about early on, or did it take a little bit of time? And ultimately, like we've teased already, what are things like now?
Let me first start by saying, just like every corner of the globe, there was so much news, there was so much information coming to light, and it was coming out so fast. And not only that, from day to day, the information was changing. So we were all trying to stay ahead of the pandemic best as we could. Our approach as a business, I would say it wasn't really trial and error. Again, being a global company and especially being a genetics company, we really focus on keeping our people and our birds safe. So we have rigorous biosecurity measures in place, and we're constantly testing for disease. So while this global pandemic, of course, was hitting people really hard, our business had the right tools in place to properly transition those learnings into what we were seeing with a human pandemic. So I think we adapted extremely well to all the protocols that were put in place. But again, going back to it, this was a lot different. This wasn't an animal disease we were dealing with. This was a human pandemic, or is a human pandemic. So again, our primary concern was keeping people safe. And once we knew we could do that successfully, we could really work the issues and get product to our customers. And you touched on this, Sam. The New Zealand government was really quick to this, and they were fantastic. They provided us lots of information on what they called safe operating procedures and protocols. And then we, as a New Zealand team, and then an Aviagen team globally, we took those ideas, shared them to keep the business functioning, again, while keeping our teams absolutely safe. But again, there was lots of fear, lots of anxiety and anticipation early on because no one really knew what we were dealing with. We're extremely lucky that our leadership team in New Zealand, we talk multiple times a day to combat any issues as they arose. In addition to adapting to all this, thinking about the supply chain and how it specifically affected our customers was at the top of our minds too. As far as how things are now, again, COVID is still at the top of everyone's minds. Again, New Zealand, we went to yeah, that's right. We went to a hard and fast lockdown with the number of cases we had compared to the rest of the world. And I won't go to the approach of the rest of the world, but in New Zealand specifically, it was a really quick, hard, fast lockdown. So the cases have been relatively low. But as we, as a population, as an industry, look out at the rest of the world, we know that this isn't just going to disappear overnight. We've had a couple of snap lockdowns where a few cases popped up, but thankfully these haven't led to the country going back into these more strict level 4 type lockdowns that we saw in early to mid 2020. As a country, we've historically been a great holiday destination, but now, in essence, the borders are closed. So this lack of tourism has impacted restaurants and hospitality pretty hard. And then also labor movements from outside of the country. New Zealand's only allowing in citizens and residents. So all visitors, all that movement has in essence, it's virtually stopped. So no one can come into the country. And again, I touched on this a couple minutes ago, but minimal flights and the complete lack of flights is a huge issue. So we're constantly working with airlines and directly with our customers to get our product out the door. But again, as a business, we continue to work by these enhanced protocols. So we're restricting movements inside our facilities. So we only allow visits of an essential nature, and we limit work groups. So this is just in the event that we're affected again. We can't see our business or the supply chain fail. So we're still acting under pretty rigorous and strengthened protocols. But again, we're also aware that this pandemic is not just New Zealand, it's not just our business, and it's not just our industry. So as a company, we've continued our goal of community outreach, so in helping people less fortunate. So even though we're still trying to maintain our business, we know that lots of people in different industries are being affected, whether through loss of jobs, loss of income. So we're still going out and helping by looking at food banks and looking at how we can help people who are, of course, a lot less fortunate than we are.
The advantage that you have of all these different locations throughout the globe that are trying to combat this pandemic, it offers a unique sense of intel on how to go about the best practices and operational procedures to move forward. So I think that's pretty interesting and a unique position to be in. And the other thing, when we decided we were going to have this conversation, was that it was a discussion around New Zealand's numbers being low, it basically not being there. But in reality, the pandemic is still affecting you guys with what you mentioned about the jobs and the economy, and basically the borders are shut down. No one can come in or out except for residents. So the pandemic is still hitting.
It absolutely is. And in fact, over the last couple of weeks, we had a few cases pop up in New Zealand. So Auckland, which is our largest area, went into a level 3 lockdown, while the rest of New Zealand went into a level 2 lockdown. So it's at the forefront of everyone's minds, because once we go into these lockdowns, in essence, travel, movements, industry shuts down. So we're still working constantly around that. Even traveling into and out of Auckland, when that stops, it makes it a lot more difficult. So that's where things like really touching base with all the stakeholders like MPI, PNs, all those groups to really figure out a coordinated approach to ensure our stock still gets to where it needs to go is absolutely key for our business.
These operational changes, how they've affected your industry, how do you see that affecting your company as a whole moving forward, whether it be in New Zealand or globally, especially considering how you guys were prepared to handle these kind of things? What did you learn from it, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so again, Aviagen and the industry in general, the poultry industry in general, we have a huge responsibility in feeding people, not only today, but tomorrow in a sustainable way. So we, of course, won't be taking a break anytime soon. Again, going back to kind of one of the core fundamentals of our industry and our business, it's biosecurity. So we were lined up correctly to kind of handle this. Again, we took those learnings from the animal side and transitioned those to the human pandemic side. I've had multiple conversations with people in our industry, and we were lined up absolutely correctly to handle something like this. So while we did see changes, it wasn't the level of change that lots of different industries saw. We're an essential business. We have a huge role in feeding people. Taking those learnings to continue that was absolutely key for us. Again, human health is still paramount. The only way we can continue doing what we do is by keeping people safe, keeping them healthy, keeping them coming to work. So that's a key piece. But until the supply chain, such as flights, border measures ease or go back to pre-COVID levels, we're likely going to see some of these issues. But we won't stop doing what we're doing. We won't stop looking at every single avenue possible to get our breeding stock to every corner of the globe. That's part of what we do.
It's definitely come a long way than where it was a year ago. So that gives me hope that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and I think a lot of other folks too.
Absolutely agree with that. What we have to bank on is you touched on this, everything we've learned, but hope as well. Hope that it's going to get better, and hope that we can continue doing what we're doing, and of course hoping that the pandemic doesn't affect any more people. That's probably the best way to discuss it is hope, learning what we have from the past, but hoping the best for the future.
Definitely. And I think once we get used to life changing for the pandemic, it'll go back to the way it was, and we'll have to adjust to being normal again.
That's right. That's absolutely right, Sam.
Well, Abby, thank you so much for being on here today. We've definitely covered a unique perspective of this pandemic with this discussion, and I appreciate your insight into all of it. Before we sign off here, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
No, just want to thank you again, Sam. Again, I really appreciate the U.S. Poultry Science Association, especially reaching out outside of the U.S. borders to look at a different perspective. It's again, we'll all keep doing what we're doing.
And like you said, poultry is global, so we got to connect globally.
That's right. Exactly right, Sam.